This is a review of the 2011 Steve McQueen film Shame. No, not that Steve McQueen. This movie stars Michael Fassbender and Carey Mulligan, and this movie was suggested to me by not one, but two viewers of this channel. That's right, this channel has two viewers. Hard to believe, I know. And today, I'm making a video that those two viewers might actually want to watch. If you're new here, I do take requests. It takes a long time for me to take them, but I do. There's a couple outstanding requests as well. Don't worry, I'll get to them. If there's some movie that you think I might like, if there's some movie that you like, if there's some movie that you don't like, if there's some movie, leave it in the comments on some video, and I'll try and watch it at some point and do a review up here so that we can all compare notes on things. It's surely one of the most interesting things about watching movies and such. So, Shame, this is obviously a high-caliber movie. You don't need to watch the movie to know that this is going to be a high-caliber movie. Look at who directed it, look at who stars in it, look at the subject matter, and look at what certain people have said about this movie. Look at how it was marketed even. It's pretty clear this is going to be a high-caliber movie, a serious movie, a forceful take on a rarely covered subject. So this movie is about sex addiction, basically. I do a horrible job at telling people what actually happens in movies on this channel, which is, I guess, a good thing maybe. But for this one, basically all you need to know is that Michael Fassbender's character, Brandon, is a sex addict who works in some corporate, vague corporate industry, whose private life is disturbed when his sister comes to visit. That's about all you need to know. This is a pretty well-known movie. So this review will not be the same as when I review some random old movie that very few people have seen, where I might, talk about the movie in very broad strokes, try to convince people to watch it, things like that, give some of the more general context. Today, I bring out the microscope to try and, give some subtle conclusions, I guess, about a movie that many more people have seen and that's already been reviewed, trying to do something a little bit productive. So, I think one of the first things to talk about is that this is a movie that has many different modes. It dabbles in a couple of different modes. And what do I mean by that? Well, in some ways, this movie is kind of a number of different sub-movies. And they're not exactly cleanly divided. The first two I'll mention, actually, are more or less simultaneous. To some degree, this is just maybe inspiration, but who knows? Point is, different modes. So the first one is American Psycho. This should be a pretty obvious parallel. This movie has big similarities to American Psycho. Some of them are in the content, the plot, that are, pretty obvious, and the characters that are pretty straightforward. There are some things that are a little bit more subtle. For instance, I feel like most of this early part of the movie, the American Psycho bit, a lot of the action, a lot of the movie seems to take place in quotation marks. Hopefully that means something to you, but there's some characters that just seem a little bit larger than life, not exactly naturalistic. The character Dave, who's Brandon's boss in particular, seems like this sort of, in quotation marks to some extent, like there might just be some slight satirical edge to the film, perhaps. There's other more literal things that are in common. For instance, the record collection that Brandon has, maybe that reminds you of Christian Bale's character. Can't remember his character's name. Christian Bale's character. Patrick Bateman. There we go. Patrick Bateman's love of fine music. Some of the ways they show New York, so this is a New York movie as well. Some of the ways they show New York, mostly it being dark and rainy, are in common. There's other more subterranean elements that might be in common as well. For instance, in some of the earlier parts of this movie, there's some snatches, some undercurrents of technological anxiety to some degree, shifting technology. Some of this you see. There's a couple different aspects of technology here, and I'm not going to get too sidetracked. But for instance, there's a lot of new laptops in the movie, technology like that. So you've got the sort of specter of modernity around, and there's a little bit of a twist there that I won't spoil, but in what laptops actually end up being used for in the role that it has in the movie. Brandon's laptop, interesting piece of the movie, but there's also at work sort of talk of a virus. This term virus is used in a couple of different ways, once to describe sort of online videos or something like that, which is kind of interesting to hear about in 2011, and wants to describe a literal virus on a computer. So some sort of technological subplot that you might argue exists in American Psycho 2 with the devouring of stray cats and such. Nonetheless, interesting part of the movie. Another thing that I think is an interesting part of this sort of mode of the film is that it does a good job of of showing how some people who might be depraved, broken, in some ways, struggling in some ways, depending on your level of empathy for Brandon, they might be completely able to fit into society in other ways, whether it's fitting in on the subway in New York. Of course, that's not very hard to do. Or if it's opening a door for an old woman, right? I think there's a number of places where Steve McQueen very deliberately shows us Brandon meshing with society and meshing very deliberately, where he has a private life that might be completely wild, but his public life is still manicured and maintained. Obviously, the public and private life is a very clear theme of this movie. Probably from my one-sentence overview of what the movie's about, you would have already picked up on that, where there's a very extreme private life, a very extreme internal life battles going on under the skin, but the public life is very controlled. And of course, when Sissy, the sister, comes to visit, those things sort of collide, and that's where that's where issues start to form. What was I talking about, though? Right. I think there are very deliberate moments where Steve McQueen calls out to this. One of them is when Brandon opens a door for an old woman. Like I said, there's another one where he goes through a door and he says, "Hey," to someone who lives in his building. There's another one where he does something upstanding and he puts his boss, Dave, in a cab at the end of a night out. Right. So he seems to be able to connect. And on that night out, he seems sort of suave to some degree, but we get an interesting little balancing act here, because you have a protagonist who's kind of a depraved character. Interesting balancing act between whether or not you're going to be, not exactly rooting for him, but if you're going to be pulling for him in some ways at some times, or if you're going to be kind of disgusted by him. And maybe American Psycho had something similar going on as well. A final thing to note is this idea of being cool and collected, but not in control. So Brandon exemplifies this. Like I said, his public life is manicured. But when things go wrong, you see him very clearly. And again, I think this is so deliberate from Steve McQueen. You see him directing his anger and his aggression haphazardly. It goes places where he might not intend, or where it doesn't really make sense. So like I said, there's sort of an American Psycho mode to this thing. The second mode is interspersed with this sort of simultaneous, but I think it is distinct in some ways, and this is the Requiem for a Dream mode. Now, obviously, it should be pretty obvious. It should be pretty obvious why, what some of the similarities are, at least in content, of course. But I think the stylistic similarities are maybe some of the more interesting ones. This section of the film is the section that's kind of disconnected, cyclic, spiraling, disconnected in that maybe one shot is connected to the other, but not chronologically, or something like that, where you see different parts of the day sort of being jumbled together to some degree. You see a routine being shown, but not in this like scheduled way, instead in this sort of very disconnected way. I think if you watch the movie, that'll make sense. There also is a lot of, this is a non-chronological thing going on here. And one thing that's interesting about this is that in the beginning of the movie, there's some very obvious non-chronological elements, but there are some slightly more subtle non-chronological things that happen later on that might signal a reintroduction to this Requiem for a Dream mode. Similarly, the music that we have at the beginning, which goes away, which changes kind of drastically in the middle of the film, comes back later on and might again signal a return to this. So this is a movie that is clearly, Steve McQueen is clearly in control of the style here. And this is a movie from 2011. So in 2011, people know how to make movies. People know how to use basically any different stylistic element that's out there or something. This is not a really early film where people are still developing the invisible style. This is not a radical 60s films where people are trying to burn things down or whatever. There's a lot of things, a lot of tricks that are known by 2011. And Steve McQueen clearly knows how to do these things to get this sort of vibe of Requiem for a Dream, like I said, that's mostly stylistic, to get the vibe of American Psycho. There's also, I think, one scene in specific that I think kind of sums this up is this. There's a scene that takes place on a train kind of early on in the movie. A train. Well, it's the subway. I think it's the F train. I can't remember. At 28th. Anyway, this scene is an interesting scene. It's hard to tell if the events are literally occurring, or if it's some sort of dream-like scene, or if it's some sort of fantasy or something like that, or if maybe all those things have sort of collided and converged inside of Brandon's head and his day-to-day life, his experience between going from his extremely isolated, secluded and extreme private life into the public life, if that's if that is a surreal experience for him, and doing something as simple as sitting on a train becomes a surreal, almost dreamlike thing. I think that is the point. Anyway, the style in that scene is very particular to carry that off, and it really works. And it's also a huge contrast to some of the ways that other parts of the movie work. So like I said, the first two modes are kind of similar, but later on, not at all. So later we get sort of a more humanist mode at one point. And I think one of the scenes with Marianne sums us up most, kind of the main scene with her. And this scene reminds me a lot of a movie called Secrets and Lies, directed by Mike Leigh, which is not as famous of a movie as as Requiem for a Dream or American Psycho, but Steve McQueen would have seen it. I'm not claiming, of course, that Steve McQueen is ripping anything off here, that he's copying or cheating or anything like that. But here we get a huge contrast. Instead of having acting that seems like it's in quotation marks, instead of having sort of very tightly controlled characters, we get more time. Well, and instead of having shots that sort of drift from one part of a day to another, and instead of having conversations that are unfinished and hurried and not given time and such, here we actually do get time. We get a long, sort of drawn out conversation that's given time to build, given time to go from being awkward to being a little bit more of a connection to some degree. And this, like I said, it's totally different from some of the other parts of the movie. There's another part of this too. These parts I'm going to talk less about because I don't want to spoil the movie. I have as much or more to say about them, but I don't want to make a really long video or spoil the movie, so I won't. Anyway, the last mode I think is kind of a more didactic thing. And essentially what this means is that there's a couple of points where the movie kind of asks the questions of whether or not you'd want a woman that you know to be treated this way, right? So you see Brandon's habits, you see what he does, his morals, and there's a couple of places where the movie kind of asks, well, would you want someone you know to be treated like that? And this is, again, totally different. Like, this didactic moralism thing is completely different from the sort of very cool, isolated style early on, or the very humanist thing you get later. But I think all these things are pretty distinctly in the movie. So we get a lot of different angles here. And in some ways, we never get an end to any of these stories. And I think this is the one of the things that's interesting about this movie. And this is one of the things that I did not expect about this movie, and that really is going to be the crux of this whole review, essentially, is that this is in some ways a dense movie, and in some ways having these different things go on is a virtue, because you are prevented from hopping onto any easy answers. As soon as you think maybe that one as soon as you think that you've gotten a read on how things are going to go to somewhere, how you're going to relate to characters or something like that, or what may happen, or the logic of the movie or something like that, it shifts a little bit, and that's interesting. That could be a virtue. On the other hand, I could understand people feeling like the characters here are a little bit cryptic, and like the story is maybe incoherent to some degree. And so I'm kind of on the fence about this whole thing. Like I said, this is a great movie, but this question in particular, and here's one way to think about it. Right, you could take some of these portions, and it could just be the whole movie. For instance, you have movies like Requiem for a Dream that are they do one of these things. Requiem for a Dream is a very extreme movie, not subtle at all. It goes all in on one basically element, and it is an extremely memorable and vivid film, but in some ways maybe one-trick pony to some degree, and certainly not subtle. So you might say, hey, this movie does more than that because it has that viewpoint, but it also challenges that viewpoint by contrasting it with other things, by showing you this up against other things going on. On the other hand, you might say, ooh, this movie is a bit less than that because it can't do that thing well, and it also tries to do these other things, and it just comes off, being a bit confusing, a little bit strange. And I don't really know where I stand on this. But I will elaborate to some degrees in case this isn't making any sense. There are some specific elements in this movie that are kind of difficult to reconcile, for instance, or that are slightly distracting in some ways. Drug use is an example here. This movie, there are a couple of moments of drug use in the movie that threw me for a loop a little bit when I was watching it, where I was sort of thinking that one sort of thing was happening, that a character was moving in one direction or was going to do a certain thing, and then drug use would pop up kind of from nowhere because the movie's not really about that, and would make you think, wait a minute, what's actually going on here to some degree? The characters in this are kind of hard to read, and there are elements, like I said, that are hard to reconcile. This could be a virtue because in life there are elements that are hard to reconcile, and there are people that are hard to read, but it's a very fine balance, I think, between making a film that is complex, that is ambiguous, that is uncertain, and making a film that makes sense where you can latch on to the characters or something like that. And I don't think that this movie gets the balance wrong, but you can see it teetering a little bit. So maybe I'll come back to this, but there's some other important things about this movie. This is an intimate film. I mentioned already how pretty obvious thing about this movie is the public and the private life. One of the ways that the movie really sells the private thing in this is with its use of nudity. This is a very interesting part of the movie. So this movie is rated NC-17, not because it's super violent, but because it has full frontal nudity from men, which is an issue for the censors, I guess, even though it might not be an issue if it is women. But argument for another time, I guess. Anyway, this is pretty rare to see it in a movie, obviously, because most producers don't want to have an NC-17 rating just to show something that may or may not be sort of central to the plot, or that can be worked around, or that people aren't expecting to see, or something like that. But in this movie, they take a risk, and in general, this is a pretty brave movie. They take a risk, and they have this male nudity, and I think it completely opens up the sort of private life of Brandon, right? Michael Fassbender's character. You see him laid bare, essentially. That's kind of a simple way of putting it, but I think that part works to some extent. There's a really interesting nudity in general is an interesting part of this movie, and in particular the gaze in the movie, the way the gaze works. In this film is interesting and complicated. So if you aren't familiar, there's people talk about fairly often this idea of the male gaze in film, particularly older movies are shot basically as if some horny guy walked into a room and started looking around. So they're going to show various elements of a woman's anatomy are going to be used to introduce characters to drive the plot forward and such. And yeah, the male gaze, kind of a self-explanatory term. Laura Mulvey, I think, is the one who's usually credited with that. And in some ways, this movie, being about a sex addict, it's focusing on kind of a man who has the ultimate male gaze. And there are a number of times where it has like point of view shots coming from Brandon's perspective where the film has that. Now, the film itself is kind of distanced maybe from the gaze and shows things in much more of I don't know what is a good term here, but it shows things in more honestly, in more candor, more raw. And having Michael Fassbender's character appear nude in the film is perhaps one of the ways that they do this, where they're sort of balancing out to some degree the point of view shots, where you get something from Brandon's perspective, and you see the film itself showing things much more dispassionately, trying not to fall into the gaze itself, but to be sort of a neutral, dispassionate observer. Okay, I think you get the idea. So that's just an interesting thing to point out. And it's also worth noting that the way they handle this changes a little bit in the different modes that I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to go back through all of that, but it's an interesting thing to watch for when you're watching the movie, is how the camera actually might fixate on women or on men. Okay, what was I talking about? Right, clearly an intimate film. It's also a clearly detailed film, so a lot of thought went into this movie, without a doubt. There's parts where it seems the world just seems pretty high resolution, pretty gritty, pretty there. Whether or not this is like Brandon having a can of Red Bull in one scene, or if it's him opening the refrigerator and taking out a jug of juice that looks like a real product, not like some fake movie thing. And I think the beverages is the only thing that's realistic about the movie. No, I mean that's one element of it that seems pretty realistic. I guess realistic isn't quite the right word, but seems kind of gritty in high definition, something like that. Like I said, this movie's filmed in New York. The setting is slightly on the dark and rainy side, but I think they do a pretty good job of showing the city. Another thing that's interesting to think about in this movie is the way they handle physical geography, right? So there are some portions of the movie where like I said, things are very disconnected, and it's very hard to understand how you get from one place to another, and such. There are other parts of the movie that are kind of the opposite, right? So the subway plays a big role in this film, and you see a lot of traveling on the subway. So there, at least, you get the idea of motion, even if you might still. Subways have this interesting nature of being sort of simultaneously locating and dislocating, because on the one hand they're very much fixated in geography, because you get on at one station and you get off at another station. It's all about a map and getting from one place to another. On the other hand, the entire journey is essentially blind. You don't really know where you're going. So simultaneously locating and dislocating. This movie kind of hops on that bandwagon where you see Brandon sort of riding the subway a bunch, but it's not really clear. It's sort of a liminal thing, right? Locating and dislocating. Okay. I'm going to try to get through this a little bit. But like I said, similar to the way the gaze works, the way the geography of the film works is interesting too, and it also changes a little bit from section to section. Obviously, the more Requiem for a Dream parts are much less clearly geographic, where he sort of morphs from one location to another, almost as if in a dream. And then the humanist part features a walk outside from one place to another or something like that, where it's like, oh, this is a real city and such. So they do a pretty good job of that. Perhaps a slightly one-dimensional view of New York in some ways. Although I will say, after I watched this movie, I thought, it's not always raining here, and I walked outside and I got absolutely soaked because it was pouring rain last night. Anyway, right. There's two exceptions, I would say, to the location filming thing that didn't really do it for me. One of them is the scene with Marianne. There's a waiter. That character didn't really fly for me. I can kind of understand why Steve McQueen put him in that scene to sort of set the tone, set the vibe of that conversation, and to sort of break things up and enforce a certain rhythm in that scene. Makes sense? But that waiter just did not seem realistic at all. Yeah, odd vibe. And I mean, you're supposed to get an odd vibe from him, but like I said, I could do without that part. Similarly, the Jazz Standard, not the Jazz Standard, the Standard Hotel, and the top of the Standard is the bar there. I wasn't really sold on that for multiple reasons, but I don't want to nitpick here. But like I said, mostly they seem to get the location, they seem to get that kind of thing right. Like I said, great attention to detail in this movie, and I think one thing that totally sells this is very subtle use of accents in this film. So Michael Fassbender, Brandon, mentions at one point that he was born in Ireland, which is interesting. And he and his sister, for the most part, just sound like Americans. Of course, neither of the actors are from the United States. But in certain scenes, when they start to get a little bit more passionate and things start to get maybe more heated, you can hear the accent coming out a little bit, right? That's great. Okay, is that maybe a slight gimmick? Well, maybe, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, they thought about this movie. They tried. Clearly, a lot of thought went into this. But like I said, you see who the actors are and who the director is. Obviously, this is going to be a movie with nice acting. Like I said, the acting shifts around from one part to another, which is kind of interesting. But clearly, attention to detail. Now, as intimate as this movie is, and as detailed as this movie is, you still get to know very little about the characters, which is kind of odd. For instance, here's one thing, is we have these characters, Marianne and Dave, who are major characters in certain parts of the film, and who are not in other parts of the film, essentially, right? Who kind of completely fall by the wayside and disappear. You might say, of course, that's part of the point. We're supposed to be seeing how Brandon's life is alienated and aleatory, perhaps. How he's on this carousel or whatever, how he sees certain things come into focus and are blurred again as he sort of goes in this spiral or whatever. And so, yeah, some characters will come in and then fade out again. Okay, I buy that to some degree. I could also completely understand somebody being like, hold on a minute, what the heck happened to these people? Like, we started off with a storyline here, and there are plot points here about these characters that just kind of disappear by the wayside and aren't followed up on. And I think this kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where the different modes of this film are in some ways a strength and in some ways a weakness. And I'm not really sold one way or the other. Sissy, the character in this movie, is another example here where, Sissy is one of the central characters of the entire film. We know essentially nothing about her. And, maybe it works. But for me, it didn't quite. In some ways, the Sissy leaves a series of messages on the answering machine at first. A little bit of a cliche, I think. A little bit one-dimensional there. Sissy's career, so she's a musician. This is not a spoiler, but yeah, it's not a spoiler, but this is something about the movie. Hope you don't mind. You learn that she's a musician, and she seems like she's almost certainly going to be like some sort of punk rocker or something. But it turns out that actually she's a jazz singer. Yeah, didn't work for me. This movie is unpredictable in some ways, and that's kind of, in some ways, I think Steve McQueen may have deliberately done that. He may have deliberately set you up one way to do that, to make you think that she's some sort of punk rock or something, and then she's actually some elegant sort of lounge singer or something like that. There are other places in the movie where he very clearly sets your expectation one way, and then once something happens, you're like, oh, shoot, the director was ahead of me. He's 2 steps ahead all along, and things are actually a bit different. And where it comes off nicely, and where this movie is unpredictable in some ways, and where that is a virtue. But in this, it doesn't. Not every part is like that. And for me, I think Sissy is in some ways an example of a character who is a bit of a cipher, and in some ways a little bit incoherent, hard to judge, hard to read, hard to follow. And that's not exactly ideal, I guess. Hard to know. I think, the flip side of this is that you could say that what this movie has, well, one thing that this movie definitely does have is a shifting empathetic landscape. And I think this is a virtue, right? So the idea here is that, like I said, the movie's unpredictable in some ways, in some very literal ways, but it's also sort of hard to, it has a complex empathetic landscape. I already mentioned, for instance, that having sort of a depraved character as the protagonist is a sort of a complex empathetic landscape. Do you pull for him? Do you not? That's the most obvious way of phrasing this, but basically those questions are iterated on and asked with much more complexity and much more varied situations. But not only is it a complex landscape, it's a shifting landscape, right? So there are times where you think a character might grow in a certain way or change in a certain way, or where you think you might not grow in a certain way or not change. And then something a little bit different than you might expect happens. And there were a couple of times where this happened where, like I said, I was thrown for a loop, like the drug use thing I mentioned, kind of breaks up your empathetic storyline for the movie. But in general, I think that shifting empathetic landscapes are a good thing. And usually I'm a big fan of this, and I think it's a virtue of most movies. And I think it probably is a virtue of this movie. But there are just some questions here. Do you want, how do you relate to Brandon as he goes along? Do you want him to grow? Do you want him to succeed? Do you think he is growing? Do you think he is succeeding? Do you want his relationships that he might form to grow? What do you want? It's a hard question to ask or to answer for this movie. And so, like I said, it's a very tough balancing point between making a complex, ambiguous movies. This movie is more on the complex and ambiguous side of things. And it, I think, makes a couple of sacrifices in cohesion, I guess, and decisiveness. And that doesn't necessarily map onto the movie being more intellectually stimulating, right? Movies that are more complex and ambiguous, yeah, I won't get into it, but I think there's a sweet spot here that you can hit, and I think the movie slightly misses the sweet spot. But, like I said, obviously a good movie. And, if you like serious movies, this completely delivers, right? It's a serious subject. It's well portrayed, incredible attention to detail, great acting. And it's a movie that you're not going to walk away from thinking, well, the moral of the story was X, right? The moral of the story was Y. Or, wow, I sure liked that this character did this. You're not going to draw those kinds of conclusions with this movie, of course. And that's great. I mean, that is obviously a virtue. Big fan in that regard. And one of the mechanics, like I said, for this is that the movie just has different sort of lenses, different sort of facets, different sort of modes that it uses to tell the story. And in some ways, like I said, contrasting those things, putting them together might make this a stronger movie. In other ways, it might make it a slightly less coherent movie that would maybe be slightly annoying. for some people. So that's Shame. Like I said, overall, I recommend this movie. Great movie. If you like serious movies, you should watch this movie. Without a doubt, this is not like an extreme sledgehammer of a movie like Requiem for a Dream. This is, I think, a more subtle, more convoluted, you might say, thing like that. But certainly it is a forceful movie that does its subject matter justice and that does its characters justice. So, like I said, I'd recommend it. That's Shame, directed by Steve McQueen.